Welcome everybody to week 14. There we go, nearly done. Boom. All right, couple of announcements. First of all, you should have received a link to the course evaluation site. I also believe the link is on the front page of D2L as well. If you can go ahead, we've been asked to, the response rate has been pretty dire. So we've been asked to remind you, if possible, to go ahead when you can and respond to that link. Thank you to Austin out there who gave me a hilarious link to, if you remember, we talked about cultural appropriation with DNA, with 23andMe. South Park, many of you may know, a wonderful American comedy, did a skit about it, and it's really funny. I'm not going to play it because it's also got some language issues, and I don't know if people are maybe watching with young children, but when you're ready, you can go and take a look at that. It's very funny. Today, we're going to just quickly review the first half of chapter 7 that you read for last week, and then we're going to cover the second half. Next week there will be no formal lecture. Okay, so there's not going to be a lecture class in here, those of you that are here, and there's not going to be a video up. However, there is going to be a final reading. There's one final reading post, and if you do all your reading posts, you'll see in the syllabus there's an extra credit point for everybody that's done all of them. So you want to go ahead and make sure that you do that. So go to the class site for the information about your reading post. It will be under week 15 where you need to do your reading post. For those people who are here, I'm going to be here after the lab meeting for us to talk about the paper and the draft. If you want to send me something beforehand, for those people outside, if you want to email me a draft that I can take a little look at beforehand, that's great. Next week, my job really is to be available to you, physically available on Tuesday afternoon for those people that are on campus, and electronically available to everybody else. Don't send it, if you're sending me a draft or something like that, don't send it through D2L because I miss it. Just send it directly to my email account, lucy.pickering@time.edu. And if you want to send me just a section of your paper, that's fine. Don't send me a draft that's so full of errors, I'm not going to be able to focus on the content, okay? So if you want to just check one part of your paper and say, does this have the right tone? Does this look like the right kind of discussion of the literature? Then please go ahead, okay? Any questions about any of that? Okay. All right, so what you read for last week, and I already saw your post, which were great, was basically the difference between modality or medium. You can call them either medium or modality. I think your book calls them medium, but you can also call it modality. And traditionally, certainly when I started, that was about the difference between orality and literacy, meaning the difference between spoken discourse and written discourse. And that was what we meant by modality, right? But now, of course, we've got all these digital platforms, and we're going to look at a video at the end of this class. Has anyone seen the Remixing Rural Texas work of Shannon Carter? So we have a faculty member here, Dr. Shannon Carter, and she does this digital modality stuff and what she calls remixing, which is taking different things from different modalities and putting them together to tell a story. So we'll look at that at the end. But, oh, I need my textbook, I see. What you looked at last week was really orality versus literacy, right? And there was a couple of things that I mentioned in that lecture. One was the Shirley Bryce Heath Ways with Words. Has anyone read that already? No. It's a great book, and it's about two working class communities, one black and one white, and how they use discourse differently, and how this in fact has negative impacts on some parts of the community when they cross those boundaries or when they're in school. So it's a classic. It's basically a seminal sociolinguistic study of how discourse can impact sociolinguistic and social-political world, socioeconomic world. So I recommend it as a Christmas read. And then they also talked a little bit about planned and unplanned discourse, and the person there is Eleanor Oakes, who's at UCLA. So if we go to page 224 in your text, did anyone bring that? Yep. Okay. On table 7.1, you can see some of these features of planned and unplanned discourse, right? It should all make perfect sense. So unplanned discourse, there's more dependence on morphological and syntactic features learned early in life, meaning less complexity in syntactic development, right? More coordination, less subordination, if you like. Repair mechanism, present tense, less use of passive voice, nominalizations, and so on. So everything that you would expect when you're doing online production, essentially. Planned discourse, so this would also be the difference between preparing a speech and giving a prepared speech versus someone saying, oh, stand up and tell us, you know, something about yourself or something. So that's the difference. Okay, so that should have all been pretty straightforward. They also talked about Biber. You read this stuff about Doug Biber. So Doug Biber has spent a lot of time looking at how you can classify discourse along poles, along continuums, right? So the ones that you see here are the most straightforward. So, for example, you have involved versus informational production. So that should be pretty intuitive, right? Involved production is more personal, interpersonal, and so on. Informational discourse is discourse that's high in informational content and low, probably low in interpersonal content, right? So what you have is positive features inside, so things that you would expect versus negative features, right? So in involved production, we expect private verbs, that deletion, contractions, second person pronouns, lots of use of the verb do as opposed to more complicated verbs. And involved production has fewer nouns, prepositions, and attributive adjectives, right? Narrative versus non-narrative. So positive features of narrative are past tense verbs, third person pronouns except it, perfect aspect verbs, and so on. So that means these are the features that we would expect. So if you then load these features onto a continuum, you can say whether a given piece of discourse is more or less involved. So more or less interpersonal. Can someone let Sandy in? And or more and less informational, right? Sandy, make sure you take a look at the PowerPoint because there was a couple of significant housework issues at the front end. So one way that we did this was using, and I gave you the extra reading with the article. You remember I did this work with disabled and normally able. So we did work with people who used augmentative communication devices, so computers to speak. So people like Stephen Hawking, for example. And one thing we wanted to do when we collected all this data is to say, okay, what are the significant differences between the discourse produced by normally abled people and the kind of discourse produced by AAC users, right? So the way we decided to do that, one of the ways to do that was to connect it to Doug Biber's multidimensional discourse framework, right? And say what typically are AAC users doing and non-AAC users doing. And what you see here, so this is your continuum. So up here on this end of the continuum, you have involved personal production. So those linguistic features here, right, that are positively loaded for involved. And then down here, you have informational production, right? And what do you see is happening?
AAC users tend to produce more informational, actually.
Right. Right. And they're negatively loaded, so they don't produce personal, involved production, right? Which would make sense. Why would that make sense?
The problem with their device.
Right, because we talked about the problem with the device, right? They can't produce enough language, period. So all of these kind of involved things that you might use, emphatics, demonstrable pronouns, discourse particles, none of those things are in there because there's just no time. So this intuitively makes sense. Also that the non-AAC users are not very high on the involved interpersonal. And why might that be? Yes, good, because this was a workplace context. So we wouldn't expect them to be super high on the involved production, right? Because there's a lot of the discourse that we're looking at that's going to be work related. This is the next one. Perhaps you can tell me this time what's going on. What do you see going on in this one? Someone other than Jade, because I know you can see it. Nana, you want to give it a go?
Yeah, so the AAC users are closer to the non-narrative discourse
Good.
Than the non-AAC, maybe because they're more focused on saying the message shortly without extensive.
Good.
Because of the time, and then we said there is there's a waiting period. So
yes.
we wanted to make that as less as possible.
Good. So that's exactly right. So what we found was the same thing. You have a lot more narrative kinds of linguistic features in the normally abled, so the non-AAC users. Again, it's not super high on the narrative discourse because we wouldn't expect it to be, because it's a workplace context. So we wouldn't expect it to be sort of all storytelling, right? And what we find is, once again, negatively loaded for narrative discourse in the AAC users. Yeah. So they're loaded for non-narrative and not loaded for narrative. So do you see how that works? So this way you can tell something. I mean, it's one view. It's one look at the world of what are differences between discourse, discourse pictures. It's a one look at it. And so we did that paper that I uploaded for you last week. If you're more interested in this, go ahead and read it. Basically, we went through all Doug Biber's textual loadings, and that gave us then a picture. It gives you a sort of snapshot of what are some of these major differences between the discourse produced by non-AAC users and the discourse produced by AAC users. So it's a nice model. Okay, so that's that. The next thing that your book talks about is this idea of that we're going to move on to, is this idea of digital talking, right? So several of you wrote and made it very explicit that you're part of communities, discourse communities, that the rest of us have no clue about, right? There was one wonderful one which I meant to put in, of somebody at an insurance agency who had a completely, she works at the insurance agency talking to another person at the insurance, and had a completely incomprehensible conversation for the rest of us about, what was wrong and what the issue was. This is an example from Robin Reed. Dr. Reed is one of our faculty here at Lytton Lang, and she does quite a lot of stuff with fandom sites. And so fandom sites meaning anything that you get groups of people. So it could be, she does a lot of work with Tolkien. So the Lord of the Rings fandom sites, but she also does a bunch of other stuff too. And this is just an example of what that might look like and how completely impenetrable it is for most of us, unless you're part of the fandom site itself.
This is a Korean boy band, EXO, EXO.
Oh, this is a fandom site for
Korean Idol.
Oh, really?
Look at that.
Fantastic. Let me pretend I knew that. Okay, so what's it saying then? I'm just like, oh. What's this Break Wings project then? Is that a song thing?
I don't know, because
no. Oh, you're not a fan. Oh, okay. So, I mean, because I can't make any sense of this at all. I just hope armies end up in tears. They are so annoying. So is...
ARMY is a fan club of BTS.
Oh! I just hope armies ends up in tears. They are so annoying. So is BTS, of course. Okay, EXO Love plus the Daesang. That looks Korean.
Yeah, it's a Korean name, I think.
There's already... Yeah. Well, that's great. That's now makes it sort of more meaningful in a continuing means nothing to me way. That's a great, good. Love fans from Twice. MX got 7. Yeah.
And GOT7 is also another Korean boy group.
GOT7 is another Korean group?
Yeah.
Wow, K-pop is taking over the world. Wow. Okay, all right. So this is just an example of what we now could describe as coherent discourse. I mean, this to me is completely incoherent, right? But to these people on this fandom site, they're actually having a real conversation. And this is, so we're having to really think about what we mean by coherence and cohesion, right? The old-fashioned definitions we looked at right at the beginning of this semester Halliday and Hassan's definitions of, you know, coherence is a script. That sort of still works here, actually. But the cohesion is this idea of linking together with linguistic devices, right? So things like discourse markers and so on. You know, that's not super helpful here. That's clearly not what's giving it its, you know, cohesive tendencies. So we continue to need to move forward in terms of these kinds of definitions. I mean, the Halliday and Hassan definition we've been using since 1976. It's not surprising that it's now, you know, beginning to look a little worn out at the edges, because they didn't have any of this stuff. And in fact, these are all fabulous areas to think about working on for anyone who's interested in discourse, because and who actually understands some of this, which I don't, because, you know, we're now at a place where we want to say, well, what is making this coherent and cohesive, you know, because it clearly is. That happened before. I don't know what that is. All right. Okay, the next thing your book talks about was expertise and knowledge in this world of Google. And this is something that Sal's had a lot of interest in. So I pulled some information from a plenary that he did for the teachers something or other at Tolson. And because his concern is exactly this, like how do you identify an expert when everyone could be an expert, if you see what I mean, what's, you know, happening. So he started by saying that there'd been three major changes: the invention of writing, the invention of printing with movable characters, so type, and then the advent of the internet. What they share in common is that all three are multiplicative. This is, of course, Sal's words, not mine, but, you know, all three of them you can just keep reproducing. So it multiplies the number of people that can hear it and the number of times that you can do it, right? And if you think about, you know, when I was growing up, you did actually have to buy books. Now, with digital reproduction and distribution, essentially once the setup is there and the platform is there, it costs nothing to continue to reproduce it, right? So now you're overwhelming the zeitgeist with a whole bunch of stuff, right? And therein lies the problem. Like, what's the good stuff and what's the bad stuff, right? Still, someone needs to make that assessment. So digital publishing, part of the problem is some of the stuff is behind paywalls, meaning that you have to pay to get a hold of it. And some of the stuff is freely accessible, right? So commercial print publishers that have pivoted to become online publishers are usually behind a paywall, right? They might show you a couple of things, but essentially your university has to pay to be allowed, you know, for you to have access to that. So that's the ones that you'll recognize: Elsevier, Springer, Wiley-Blackwell, Taylor and Francis. So they account for over 50% of publishing overall now, these big ones. Not so much for us in the humanities and social sciences, but in a lot in the humanities, but a lot in social sciences and hard sciences. But now we've also got some things that are not behind a paywall, right? Like Google Books, Google Scholar, and a bunch of other academic things. So it's super convenient to have things that are not behind a paywall, right? Because if someone comes into my office and says, oh, Dr. Pickering, I'm interested in doing, I don't know, the price of coconuts in, you know, the 1800s, you could just go to Google Scholar and have a quick look and say, you know, well, yeah, it looks like there is some stuff on the price of coconuts in the 1800s, and a couple of those things look like they might be good, right? But you've still got to be able to make the assessment of what's the good stuff and what's the bad stuff, right? Because now we can have, anyone can put anything up there because there's no paywall to stop you putting stuff up here, right? So it can either be good or it can be absolutely dreadful, right? So one thing that started to happen pretty much in the mid-2000s was we got this idea of predatory publishers. So it took publishers a while to work out that they could scam us, basically. So Sal came up with all these numbers, so I don't have the back data on these numbers, but he'll certainly be happy to give you the details, I'm sure. A particular guy, Jeffrey Beal, started making a list to help his students recognize what was a predatory journal. And just between 2011 and 2016, he went from 18 to 923. And then he was made to take it down because of threats from some of these publishers that they would sue the university. So now God knows how many we've got out there. Somebody else has estimated 8,000 predatory journals publishing 400,000 articles. Or, you know, so anywhere between 4,000 journals and 8,000 journals publishing hundreds of thousands of articles, right? What do we mean by predatory journals? Well, we mean anything that doesn't follow what we consider to be a scientific process, an established scientific process. And the best established scientific process that we have come up with is that your paper gets double blinded, meaning no one knows who wrote it, and it gets sent out to 2 or 3 people that are recognized as knowing something about the field, right? So in my case, it would be Internation, right? So I would be one of 2 or 3 reviewers that an article was sent out to say, does this look like it's good scientific data? And does it contribute something to the field, right? Whoever is reviewing needs to know enough about the field to know, well, yeah, this has been said before a million different ways and a million different times, or yeah, this is something new, right? That's the only thing we've really come up with as the best idea of, and it's the way that we do medical research and everything else, right? So we know there are a bunch of journals that don't do that. There are a bunch of journals and this is just in our field now. This is just the journals that you might come across. And in fact, interestingly, a couple of you have come across in your annotated bibliographies, and I've asked you to take those ones out. One that came up a couple of different times is the International Journal of Humanities and Social Sciences. Right, which is totally a scam journal. You know, it doesn't check. What it does is it sends people like me or Sal or Dongmei or anybody else, once you've published, it sends you a thing because it has an algorithm that scans through all the journals. So it sends you a thing and it says, do you have a paper that you'd like us to publish? And then if you're stupid enough to give them that paper, then within 24 hours, they turn around and they say, thank you very much. We've decided we'll take your paper. Right. That's how you know it's a predatory journal, because if it takes them 24 hours, now ain't no reviewing going on, right? There's nothing happening, okay? Because reviewing takes at least 1 to 2 months, often more, 3 or 4, right? So anything that comes along and says, oh, great, within 48 hours, that's what we would call a predatory journal. These are also the people that put all the conference proceedings that they can find through an algorithm. And so suddenly you just presented, Nana just presented AMPRA, right? American Pragmatics. All of a sudden in her email box comes something from the International Journal of Literature and Art saying, we were delighted to see your presentation at, AMPRA that was accepted, and, we would be delighted to publish it for you in our, So then you give them your paper within 48 hours or 20, they say, thank you very much, we will publish it. Or they say, we will publish it if you can contribute some money for the print costs. Now, that used to be a dead giveaway, but it isn't now, because there are many journals who are trying to move to open access, traditional journals that are trying to move to open access. So they're following a model that came out of hard sciences, in which paying for print costs was perfectly reasonable. So in hard sciences, they have a long tradition of paying for print costs, a few $100s per. So that doesn't guarantee that you're looking at a predatory journal. But these ones, once you put together all the evidence, then you decide if you're looking at a predatory journal. So here's just some helpful some actual ones that you're going to come across, because they publish supposedly linguistic papers, so you might want to keep this slide as a helpful. When you get to sales level, they also say, will you join our editorial board? This is the one, International Journal of Current Innovation Research. Notification of acceptance within 24 hours. Woohoo! So, even things that sound normal, like in International Journal of Linguistics, it's just not a real journal. It sounds like it should be, but it isn't. So what's the downside if you get caught by one of these? Let's say, well, what's the downside from the perspective of being a student, and what's the downside from the perspective of being a writer, of being a researcher?
So we lose money if we're paying. And I was thinking, if let's say this happens, does it consider that you cannot publish that thing anywhere? Right?
Exactly. Yeah, because it has a DOI number. So that's it now. That data that you publish with this horror show, that's it. You can't publish that again, because that would be fraud on your new publisher. So you've just sort of dumped your work, into a pit that, you're never going to get it out of again. But what about being a student? What about you now as you're doing your bibliographic reviews?
Well, you come across research that then you would have to doubt the methodology and the results.
Right, so you end up with bad science, right? So that is, to my mind, your responsibility, right? At this point in your career, your responsibility is to take some responsibility to work out if you're looking at predatory work, okay? So one of the reasons that we give you readings and we tell you to look at the, every single chapter in this has a further readings, and then you can move from those readings to other further readings that they cite, is to keep you on the straight and narrow, right? Is to not to have you just chuck in a term in Google Scholar when you don't know that area at all, and then just pick up what comes out, right? Because that's tantamount to you not taking personal agency and responsibility for what you as students should be taking agency for, okay? So you can't stop that happening, but you can say, I am going to make it my business to know if I'm contributing to bad science or not. And, you know, you can do that any number of ways. There's lists like this one. You can email me or, you know, whomever your professor is and say, hey, does this look good or not? You know, you can do what you're supposed to do with bibliographic research, which is follow a line of sources that you know are valid and reliable. So you start with a source that she gives you, you go to that source, you look at their sources, and so you go back. So you're following a trail back through credible research, okay? What you don't do is go for the first 10 things that come up when you stick your term in Google Scholar and say, yay, me, because their PDFs are available, right? That is irresponsible graduate work, in my view. I'm not sure how much everybody feels that way, but I certainly feel that way. Perhaps less so when you're an MA student, which many of you are out there, because, you know, what do you know? But unquestionably, when you're a PhD student, your job is to make sure you are aware of these kinds of distinctions. Because unfortunately, we can't stop this happening. So the only thing we can do is refuse to make it credible in any way by refusing to cite it anywhere else. You know, even if someone you see has cited it, yeah, that doesn't mean you have to cite it, right? So what's that? Oh, well, I was gonna, yeah. This is the problem. Generally, the top 5 articles in most searches are the most frequently cited ones. Thus, these articles are more likely to be read and cited, which further improves their Google Scholar ranking. Some researchers will simply pick articles from the top results, automatically assuming that their credibility based on the sheer number of prior citations, right? And cite them in their work. So from this basis, 30% of citations are problematic, right? The number of incorrect citations was below. However, since 2009, the number of incorrect citations has exceeded 30% each year, okay? Meaning people are not doing the legwork, okay? Just because it's cited a lot doesn't mean it's any good. You have to follow the trail through credible sources that you know are good because they're part of what we're using, right? Or that you check with us are good. And you follow that trail. You don't just like screen grab the first 20 that come up on Google Scholar, because then your paper can get, you know, put through Turn It In or Authenticate, one of these things, and add to that ranking, right? So now all of a sudden you're contributing. You're contributing to the bad science because now you're another person that's citing it, right?
It's also your responsibility as a scholar to kind of stop that from being cited.
It really is. I mean, I believe it is. I don't, like I say, you would have to poll some professors to see how everybody feels, and I would certainly cut master's students a break, because going from undergraduate to graduate school is a big transition. And also a lot of master's students may not have been in school for a very long time, particularly the kind of master's students that we tend to get in applied linguistics and TESOL. You might have been out of school for 15 years, 20 years. So this was certainly not an issue when you were walking around the stacks in the library, because it wouldn't have been in the library if you couldn't use it, right? Because that's all what we call curated material. A librarian went in to credible sources and picked out, the material that curated the material that you need. So you could just walk through the stacks and find it. What you have to remember in places like Google Scholar, none of this is curated material, right? So yeah, sure. If it's easier if you've got on Google Scholar, coconuts in the 1800s PDF here, right? And you're like, oh, awesome, great. So you click on the PDF because let's face it, it's less time consuming, right? But then you look at the PDF and you say, okay, I know something about coconuts in the 1800s and, so-and-so should be cited. Where's so-and-so? I know something about humor because I've had a class with the Tardo or whatever. Where's the Tardo? He should be. I know that the general theory, where's Victor Raskin? Where's some of these people, right? By the time you're PhD students, to me, that is your job, to make sure that you understand those differences and follow credible sources, so that by the time you come to do something like your dissertation, you're not contributing to this, right? You're in a negative way. You're only contributing to it in a positive way, right? Because your dissertation is going to go on ProQuest. ProQuest is used by these people to do this kind of stuff too. So yeah, so yes, I do, Sandy. I do think it's our responsibility as PhD students, no question. Yeah. So what Atado says basically is that you've got mixed results from this idea of the internet, right? And this improved access to a multiplicity of sources and information. On the positive side, anyone can now access information faster and cheaper. You don't have to be at Harvard to have, we have the same electronic access essentially at the Texas A&M system as you would have if you had a, hundreds of thousands dollar education at Harvard, right? And that is the joy, right? That means that everybody, students at state universities have the same access to stuff as students in private universities, and that did not used to be the case just a couple of generations ago, right? You would have to go beg for information. Faculty would take sabbaticals just to go sit down in a library, a good library, so they would say, oh, I'm leaving commerce to go to, Library of Congress because all the stuff I need is there, right? Well, now you don't have to do that because through the Texas A&M system, we now have access to basically everything, pretty much. So that's the positive side. The negative side is that it's easier to distribute poor quality stuff, right? Because of this lack of paywall, people that you don't need paywalls for some of this stuff, and it gets distributed over things like Google Scholar. And all that takes up place in what Sal calls this intellectual marketplace. So, you've now got an intellectual marketplace that has all this potentially dangerous stuff in it, right? So somebody like us, or you guys particularly, because you still haven't had enough experience with the topics that you're interested in to say, yeah, that's good, that's not good, that's not good, which is all that we do. All I do is take a look at Google Scholar and say, well, that's crap, that's crap, that's good, because I've been doing it for 15 years, right? It's not a magic trick. You just haven't had time yet. So you have to do a little more backtracking and checking and seeing. But to get rid of some of this garbage from that space. Yeah, and he's got a couple of other citations. There's an increase in retraction in medical journals. anything can be published and anything can be cited. That's absolutely true. Now with vanity presses as well, literally anything can be published. Yeah. So the whole sort of tradition of, as I say, if it's published and it's in hardback and it's in the library, you're good to go, is over. So any questions or comments about that? Does anyone feel that they've been taken in by the intellectual problems of the digital marketplace?
Not yet.
Not yet?
We're not out there yet.
You're not out there yet, yeah. Well, so one of the reasons that we ask you to do the things we do, and we have you do final papers and so on, is to help you make those good decisions, you know. But you also should be learning simultaneously as you go along how to make those good decisions. As I say, just so that we don't, you know, we don't want to contribute to bad science as well. In our case, it wouldn't be because we were malevolent, you know, it wouldn't be because we were hoping to make money or anything. It would just be that, you know, they were using us to contribute to bad science, and that I don't want that to happen. All right. So Sal gives you a, you know, he has a little, in very typical Dr. Hurtado fashion, it starts with, they are out to get us. So predatory publishers are literally scammers. Distrust anyone you don't know, or ask, you know, I know. So ask, you know, if you're not sure. Yeah, tightening up reviewers. And this is also a problem because, of course, as open access journals increase, so for example, 2 of our PhD students, Elisa Gironzetti and Laura De Ferranti, started a open access e-journal, which is doing very well. They have a great board, they have great reviewers, but what this means is the pool of reviewers is getting more and more overwhelmed, right? So the more open access journals there are, the more people are coming to me on a regular basis, or to Hurtado, or to Cheng, or to Mimi Lee, and saying, I need you to review for me because you know about this and no one else, you know, this is the thing I need. So unfortunately, what happens is that maybe the reviewers themselves start to get more sloppy. Yeah, because I don't really have time necessarily to go through and do, I mean, I hope I don't contribute to bad science in that way, but that's another part of the problem, right? Getting people to really concentrate. I'm supposed to concentrate when I review on miscitations, on misunderstanding of seminal literature, on da-da-da-da-da, you know, and it gets harder and harder the more you're asked to do, because you do it all for free, of course. Again, reviewers do it to protect the intellectual marketplace from bad science. So, but the more journals that we have, the tougher that gets. And then teach our students to assess critically. So this is what we've been talking about, right? Just because it's printed, not necessarily good. Good literature review does not merely report, but engages, and in particular, omit worthless sources. Even if you like what they have to say, okay, the science isn't there to start with. So even if it meets your intuition and you're like, but this has to be right, you don't want to be citing it and contributing to this idea that anyone can put any of their intuitions out there. And some of them might be great, some of them might hit, and some of them might miss. Either way, we really don't care. We're just going to flood the place with all our intuitions and see. You know, that's what you don't want to contribute to. All right. So then the last thing that your book talked about is multimodality, right? So rather than just text, written text or spoken text, all the other kinds of ways in which texts are produced. So in this case, visual discourse, we've got someone who's doing a gesture experiment, right? So this is an experiment to see how we use gesture. So the subject is, or participant is, pointing to wherever they're told on a large screen, and these shapes are being moved around, and they have to point to wherever they're being moved to, and then they have these space sensing cubes either side, and that helps them see how far the gestures are going in which direction. That's all I got. I don't do any gesture research, but if you're interested in gesture, that's a thing, right? And obviously, it's a huge thing for sign language. One thing that we do, in fact, very specifically now, does for us at the moment, running our eye tracking lab, is eye gaze. So this is a fairly new thing, and it's the idea, and some of you have done Dr. Hurtado's eye tracking course, so you already know, but essentially it looks at how we process text using our eyes, right? So what our eye gaze tells us about what we're processing first, what we're processing last, what we're re-looking at as we process it, and so on, right? So Nana, why don't you explain loudly what the project you were just involved with Maria was about?
So Dr. Samar, she came from Spain to do the eye tracking experiment on tweets in Spanish, where the participants look at the screen and they see captions and images. The texts are humorous, and the study intends to see where do they look first. Do they read the caption, then at the image, or image, caption?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And she found, do we know what she found?
In the process.
We're in the process of finding out what she found. Yeah. Okay, good. So this is the, basically you set up the machinery so you can look at, well, this is for interactive eye tracking, right? So this is, you set up the machinery to see if people look at the mouth or the eyes when somebody else is talking. And another thing that eye tracking has been used with a lot is commercial products, like how do people process labels and so on. It's been used to look at menus. What are the things that people look at the most on a menu? So then you might move those things up to a higher part of the menu, or what do people look at least? You might kind of shove those off to the side. So it can be used, it has lots of commercial applications. But again, it's another form of multimodal text, right? Another form of multimodality, which we've talked about already in a couple of different lectures, but is the sound patterns, right? So within a spoken text, you have a whole set of sound patterns that are expected. The listener will expect certain sound patterns to occur based on their familiarity with the language. So this, for example, is a typical utterance in traditional Englishes. So in American English or British English or Canadian English, we will have a single unit, tone unit, with at least two prominences in it, right? So let me think of an example. How are you doing, right? That would be, how are you doing? You know, with one each end. How are you doing? And so the stress will appear. Not all units will have this double stress, but it's a very consistent pattern for traditional Englishes. And I meant to put the sound file in here and then I forgot. But this is a very typical kind of contrastive stress pattern that uses that suspension bridge contour. So we can use the pH meter to measure the acidity or alkalinity of compounds, right? So we have this kind of, you know, on the important points. If the pH value is lower than 7, it's an acid. If the value is larger than 7, it's a base, okay? So it's following this very clear prominence patterning, and it's a pattern that, you know, if you don't use it, if you say the pH value is lower than 7, then you can see that you start getting really confused, right, about the message, because you're listening. Basically, what listeners are listening for is the next prominent syllable, the next important piece of information. So if you have a spoken text that doesn't follow that example, so a spoken text in which the English or the language does things differently, this can be a real problem. This is something that appears in some new Englishes, Singapore, Malaysian, called heavy end stress. And heavy end stress means that whatever is at the end of the unit gets stressed, regardless of whether it's new or old information. Okay? So in that first one, it would be, it's not only the assignments you have to mark, but also the number of assignments you have to mark. Okay? I didn't know you liked classical music. I've always liked classical music, right? Or what is it? Don't ask, just eat it. I thought you wanted a black one. No, a blue one, right? So you can see these are the better examples, to be honest, because when the heavy end stress appears on an unstressed, what for us would be unstressed, right? What is it, right? What is it? Don't ask, just eat it is what we would say. But in traditional English, it's right. Don't ask, just eat it, right? Is what and that's the heavy end stress on that final pronoun. Here's a particularly good one. I thought you wanted a black one, right? So the contrast that we saw here, acidity, alkalinity, lower, higher, that contrast has disappeared, right? The stress is on the one. In fact, the important contrast is the difference between the colors. Black one, blue one. And here, it's not a blue one, it's a blue one, right? So again, we've lost that, that prominent structure. So these are ways in which, when we think about multimodality, we're going to have to start doing more and more work on, right? It used to just be literacy meant just looking at a text, a written text, and orality meant basically also looking at a written text, a transcript of a morphosyntactic transcript, right? But now it's becoming more and more significant that we look at these other issues. So I wanted to end today by talking to you about a new literacies thing that we have here. And I don't know how many of you know about the Center of Converging Literacy. So the Center for Converging Literacies is Dr. Shannon Carter, who is one of our Comp-Rec people here. Thank you. And she has spent a lot of time doing what she calls digital humanities. So this is a really good example of putting together sources, different sources from different places. And she actually includes so geolocators and stuff like that. Now I tried to, this was the one that, remix. Yeah, this was the one that I wanted to show you because it was a true remix. It's primary source materials are oral histories, images, video. But when I tried to show it, yeah, because of the subject, the Olympic Committee banned it. I don't know how many people have heard of Juan Carlos, maybe more people outside than in here. So Juan Carlos is an African-American runner who went to the Olympics, and when he won a medal, stood up at the medal and made a salute. And the salute was to protest treatment of African Americans in America, right? So it wasn't a Nazi salute or anything like that. He literally, it was a Black Panther kind of salute. You just put a glove on and put his hand up. So I can't show you this original remix because they won't allow it, but I found a version of it on her, so we're going to try and do that instead. Now, the interesting thing about John Carlos, is that he was here at East Texas before he won the Olympics. And so the remix that I'm going to show you is about him. You know, you're going to see how Shannon Carter put this together. And the reason it's also interesting for us today is because part of her question is who gets to do this? Who gets to own this discourse and own this story and so on? So it's a 10-minute video. I should be able to get it. And the narrator is our Professor Shannon Carter. And we've got no, okay.
All we ask for is equal chance to be a human being. And as far as I see now, we're 5 steps below the ladder. And every time we try and touch the ladder, they put their foot on our hand and don't want us to climb up.
The Black Power disciples Tommy Smith and John Carlos, the Olympic 200 meters gold and bronze medalists, had been suspended by the United States Olympic Committee and given 48 hours to leave Mexico.
We have invented the nigger. I didn't invent it. White people invented it.
John Carlos was born in Harlem in 1945. There he learned his earliest lessons about racism's impact on everyday life. He attended a school named for Frederick Douglass, where students learned nothing about this legendary figure. Yet Carlos learned everything he could from the living legends who surrounded him, and he kept learning long after they were gone. East Texas taught Tommy Smith and John Carlos fundamental lessons about social justice. At the height of the Jim Crow era, Smith and his family picked cotton across East Texas. He was 6 when they left Texas for California, where they would, ironically, end up picking grapes. John Carlos learned these lessons as a college student at East Texas State University in 1966. He was fast, faster than anyone in this area had ever seen. He broke numerous records and carried the ETSU track team to countless victories. In return, he was given a new perspective on race relations. Discrimination here in Texas has hurt me personally, he told the Dallas News. You go out of state to a track meet and you're representing not only your school, but the entire state. Yet you come back and find restaurants that don't serve Negroes, go into a place to shoot a game of pool, and they tell you Negroes aren't allowed? I could wear an Olympic gold medal around my neck, and that still wouldn't entitle me to be served in these places. From the very beginning, Carlos's athletic talents largely dominated local news. His selection for the Olympic tryouts, however, expanded that coverage and access beyond local media. It was, in fact, a global movement that provided a local forum through which he could voice his concerns. That movement was the Olympic Project for Human Rights, which he first learned about in a rather unlikely place. At the Commerce Post Office in 1967, when he picked up the latest issue of Track and Field. That article described ongoing injustices suffered by athletes across the nation.
I was reading that at the same time I was living that in terms of social issues that was taking place in society, and I was actually living those same issues at East Texas State University.
This national article about ongoing injustices prompted area coverage of this important issue. This was, in fact, the very opportunity that Carlos had been waiting for. Campus administration responded quickly, embarrassed by Carlos's statements and determined to discredit them. Days after Carlos's controversial statement appears, the athletic department calls together all of ETSU's African American athletes to discuss their positions on the matter. The official consensus led to a resolution that appeared in local press just a few days later. Soon, Carlos felt it safer to return with his family to Harlem, where he was called to a meeting with national leaders to discuss his potential participation in this proposed boycott. In attendance was none other than Martin Luther King Jr., who planned to make public his enthusiastic support of OPHR as soon as he returned from Memphis. Soon, Carlos and his family moved to California, where he joined the San Jose State University track team alongside fellow activists like OPHR founder Harry Edwards. even at ETSU, just weeks after Carlos left, students began mobilizing as never before. On the very night of MLK's assassination, for example, John Carlos's friend and classmate Joe Tave created ASSET, the Afro-American Student Society of East Texas, which helped bring about unprecedented change across the campus and the community.
I've always known that I'm not a nigger.
I think it's purely a white problem, not a Negro problem.
I'll give you your problem back. You're the nigger, baby, it isn't me.
So what did you think? Stunned silence in the room. Had you heard of John Carlos before? Ah, okay. So he was here on campus. We recognized him a few years ago after Shannon Carter did it. What do you think of this idea? Watch it, I'm going to put the lights back on. What do you think of this idea of digital remixing?
It's interesting the contrast they make on what was intended to be said and what was understood.
Right.
With the messages that they were giving.
Yeah.
And then when they played the part of the news, how the news portrayed it, it just brought me back to what is happening right now, which is like, just as you were saying about predatory journals, it's the same with the news. You really have to have your own judgment as into what is given out there. Mm-hmm. Because if you buy what the news were saying, it's really not what they were wanting to say.
Right. And then there's this issue of who speaks for you, right? I mean, that was absolutely dreadful that they got all the other African-American athletes together and said, you must say that you don't support, you know. And they're, of course, all worried about losing their scholarships or whatever. So, because they're not as good as John Carlos, right? They're not going to go to the Olympics. So they're like, you know.
Have a voice that's strong.
Yeah. So it's, I thought it was a great project. And it's one of the ways in which now, you know, you can think about joining text, image, literacy, orality all together in this kind of new idea. So there's plenty else to see on the Digital Humanities Project. This is something that Dr. Carter has done for quite some time. The second one is the link to the 10-minute video you just saw. For those people that maybe turned it off, you can watch it on your own time. And then the top link is the link to the Digital Humanities Project. All right. So for your reading post this week, I'd like you to complete activity 7.36 on page 50, which is about the combination of image and text that we've been talking about today. So it should be pretty straightforward. All the examples are in the book.
250.
250. Right. Thank you, everybody. 250. Okay, so it's complete activity 7.36 on page 250. Thank you, Nana. Okay. Any questions or comments about today? Well, that's it. That's the Barbara Johnston book. What did you think?
At first, for me, it was hard. It just like a lot of new things.
Mm-hmm.
As we started, right? I don't know, you guys too. As we started going through it, and and then with your explanations, I was able to connect with a few of the other classes that we had on or the other readings. And then I was like, oh, it's just really giving it a name to what I already know. So it was good for that.
Good, and it does connect, you know, discourse analysis has all these connecting things with pragmatics, with sociolinguistics, with, you know, all these other approaches, right? So, yeah, good. All right, well, if you're done, I'm done. Thanks very much, everybody. Remember that there's no formal lecture next week, but you will have to do a reading post. So go back in to week 15 of the class, and I'll send you out a reminder to remind you of that. And if you've done all your reading posts, including that one, then you get an extra credit point too. So it's worth going in to get that done if you've done all the others, okay? All right, thanks very much, everybody.